A flight attendant ripped up a black boy's ticket for being in the wrong line, not knowing he was the son of the FAA official who oversees their entire airline. What happened next stunned the terminal. He thought tearing a child's ticket would end the argument. He didn't realize the boy he humiliated carried more authority than his entire crew. Subscribe if you believe respect should never depend on age. 12-year-old Xavier Marin stood in the boarding line at Halvern International Terminal, his back straight, his hands wrapped around a slightly crinkled economy class ticket. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of last-minute calls, suitcase wheels dragging against tile, and the hushed murmurs of travelers juggling boarding passes and coffee cups. But amidst the movement, Xavier was still deliberately so. Dressed in a clean navy polo and pressed khakis, he didn't fidget or glance nervously like most kids his age might. His eyes, dark and steady, scanned the gate with quiet awareness. This wasn't just his first solo flight, it was a test. His uncle had made that clear. The gate ahead, marked C9 in cold blue LED, was manned by a single attendant. Tall, angular, and visibly disinterested, the man's name tag read, Bryson. He barely looked up between scanning tickets and waving passengers through. Xavier stepped forward when his turn came, extending his ticket with polite confidence. Bryson glanced down and did a double take, as though momentarily thrown off by Xavier's age. He furrowed his brow and leaned on the counter with exaggerated fatigue. "Where are your parents?" he asked, not with concern but impatience. "Traveling alone," Xavier answered, evenly, holding out the ticket again without flinching. Bryson didn't take it immediately. Instead, he let out a sharp sigh, glancing past Xavier to the line behind him. Then, in a voice just above a whisper, yet loud enough to sting, he muttered, "We've had enough trouble with your kind lately." Xavier heard it, clearly, the way the word "you're" dragged with extra weight. He didn't blink, but his fingers tightened just slightly around the paper. Without waiting for any verification, Bryson snatched the ticket from Xavier's hand with a flick of his wrist, held it up for half a second, then tore it cleanly down the center. The sound was surgical, deliberate. A quiet gasp came from someone a few feet back in line, followed by a tense silence. "Not today, kid. Stand aside," Bryson said with a smirk, as he tossed the two halves into the waste bin beside him like scraps of trash. Xavier took one step back. He wasn't trembling, but something changed in his posture. More anchored, more precise. Passengers looked around awkwardly, unsure whether to react, some pretending not to notice at all. A mother gently steered her toddler's gaze away. A man in a business suit checked his phone, face blank. The scanner beeped again as Bryson waved the next traveler through without missing a beat. The machine's soft tone felt almost mocking now, marking time like a metronome after a fall. But Xavier didn't move. He stood still, eyes never leaving Bryson. He reached slowly into the side pocket of his backpack and pulled out a flat, sealed envelope. The paper was firm, off-white, and marked with a blue emblem stamped over the flap, the unmistakable seal of the Federal Aviation Authority. Even before it was opened, it carried weight. Passengers near the front glanced at the envelope. Something about its formality cut through the terminal's hum. Xavier's voice was quiet, but his words were clear, shaped with precision. "They thought I was just another kid with no one watching," he said, mostly to himself. His fingers gripped the envelope with both care and certainty as he raised it chest high. "But I wasn't sent here by accident." Bryson Hale tossed the torn ticket into the trash can with a flick of his wrist, as if discarding a meaningless receipt. The tear still echoed faintly in the ears of the few passengers who had dared to watch. He waved the next traveler forward with a sharp motion, eager to pretend nothing had happened. The scanner beeped again, and the boarding line resumed, but the air had changed. He just didn't notice. Murmurs began to ripple from the back, soft and uncertain at first, like wind brushing leaves. A few passengers looked at one another but quickly glanced away, choosing complicity over confrontation. Xavier Marin remained perfectly still. The envelope he clutched was pristine, its seal unbroken, but his grip had tightened slightly. His expression didn't betray fear or confusion, Only stillness. The kind that unnerves adults who expect children to shrink in moments like these. The space around him seemed to widen, an invisible circle of discomfort as other passengers subtly stepped away, unwilling to be too close to what might become an incident. From the far end of the gate, Darren Luthen, a gate supervisor with a practiced sense for tension, spotted the disturbance. He walked over, adjusting his ID lanyard and brushing crumbs off his vest. As he approached, he noticed that everyone in line seemed to be looking at the boy, not Bryson. "Everything all right here?" Captain Ellison Rail stepped off the jet bridge with the sharp gait of a man used to command. His gray blazer was crisp, creased perfectly at the shoulders, and a set of silver pilot wings gleamed subtly on his chest. Around him, the air held a strange static, whispers, glances, the unmistakable hush that followed something unjust. He took one look at the cluster near gate C9 and knew something was wrong. His eyes settled on the gate supervisor, Darren, whose tightened jaw and concerned brows spoke louder than words. "What's going on?" Rail asked calmly but firmly, his voice carrying the quiet weight of authority. Darren immediately stepped forward, lowering his voice as he handed over the FAA-marked envelope. "This boy, his name's Xavier Marin. His ticket was torn up by one of our agents. I asked to confirm credentials, and, well, sir, you should read this yourself." Rail opened the envelope with steady fingers and scanned the contents. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in confusion but calculation. Then he looked up, first at the boy, then at the man beside him. "You're Xavier Marin?" he asked. The boy nodded, calm and composed despite the simmering tension around him. "Yes, sir." Rail turned his gaze toward Bryson Hale, the flight attendant who now stood awkwardly beside the gate console. His face had gone pale, lips pressing into a defensive line as he tried to predict what was coming. "Did you rip this boy's ticket?" Rail's voice was low, steady. No need to raise it. The question alone drew the stares of nearby passengers and halted the slow shuffle of boarding. Bryson stammered, his confidence crumbling like a breached hull. I didn't think it was real. I thought he was making it up. We've had fake tickets before, and..." The captain didn't blink. "So your instinct is to destroy passenger property and make assumptions without checking credentials?" Bryson's shoulders slumped. He looked down at the carpeted floor, avoiding the eyes of the growing crowd. No reply. Xavier's gaze didn't waver. He stood still, both hands holding the strap of his backpack, watching, not with vengeance, but with clarity. There was no satisfaction in Bryson's shame. Only a silent resolve to hold the moment accountable. Rail turned back to the boy. "Would you feel safer?" he asked gently. "If I personally escorted you onto the plane?" There was a pause. Not because Xavier hesitated, but because the question itself felt foreign. No one had asked what he needed. Not yet. He gave a single, quiet nod. "Yes, sir." The captain returned that nod with one of his own, then pivoted on his heel to address the entire gate crew. His voice rose just enough to be heard over the general boarding commotion. "He boards now. Full access. Priority boarding. Any objections, you answer to the FAA." The silence that followed was colder than any overhead vent. Some passengers looked down. Others whispered behind their hands. A few raised their phones and started recording. The entire gate had become a silent theater of shame and correction. Bryson said nothing more. His arms remained stiff at his sides, his posture more rigid now, not out of pride, but collapse. The weight of consequences was settling in. Xavier didn't say a word to him. He didn't need to. He turned, calmly stepped forward, and walked beside Captain Rail as they headed down the jet bridge together. The only sound was the muted hiss of the pressurized door ahead and the murmur of confused passengers trying to make sense of what they'd just seen. They moved slowly, not from hesitation but intention. Rail didn't rush. He made sure every step was witnessed by those who had looked away when it mattered. The boy walked tall, not out of defiance, but out of purpose. Just before they disappeared into the boarding tunnel, Xavier turned slightly, his voice even, his words chosen like stones placed gently in a river. "I wasn't here to cause trouble," he said. "But sometimes trouble introduces itself first." Xavier Marin's spine remained straight as the door of the aircraft sealed behind him and the cabin hushed with the rhythmic whine of the pressurizing fuselage. He didn't glance around. He didn't clutch the armrest or fidget with the seatbelt like most children his age might. He simply stepped into 2A, first class, far from the row he was originally assigned in economy, and slid into the leather seat beside the window without a word. The cushion barely exhaled beneath his light weight. His small hands rested on his lap, knuckles pale, gripping nothing. The engines hummed louder. On the runway below, luggage carts scurried like insects beneath the towering aircraft. A flight attendant approached, a man in his early 30s, with a crisp vest and sleeves rolled just high enough to reveal a nervous sweat line. He carried a tray with a neatly folded cloth napkin, a cup of orange juice, and a sealed snack pack. "Would you like something to drink?" he asked, voice lower than necessary, almost apologetic. Xavier didn't look up. His gaze remained fixed on the tarmac, the blinking yellow light of a fuel truck reflected in the airplane window. Only after a few seconds did he respond. "No, thank you," he said evenly. The attendant lingered a moment longer, as if searching for a sign of forgiveness, then nodded and stepped away, his face tight with unspoken discomfort. Around them, the other first-class passengers adjusted pillows, powered off phones, and settled in, unaware, or pretending not to know, what had occurred at the gate. At the terminal behind them, Captain Ellison Rail had just signed off on the preliminary incident report, his pen etching hard pressure into the paper. "Suspension pending investigation." The line beside Bryson Hale's name read. Supervisor Darren, standing nearby, added his signature. "Conduct review triggered. Gate C9 violation of FAA travel assurance." Their pens moved like scalpels, slicing through the quiet rot of overlooked behavior. Rail's voice was calm but direct. "He'll be lucky if suspension's all he faces." Darren glanced out toward the boarding bridge. "You know who that boy is now, don't you?" Rail didn't answer. He didn't need to. Back in the cabin, Xavier sat unmoved as the plane began to push back. The mechanical lurch made coffee ripple in plastic cups across first class. The older man across the aisle, silver hair, pressed charcoal suit, reading glasses tucked into his breast pocket, leaned forward slightly, not enough to intrude, just enough to connect. "You handled that better than most adults I know," he said softly, his voice carrying the calm of someone who had seen many things but still chose to be surprised by decency. Xavier blinked, then turned his head just enough to meet the man's eyes. "This wasn't about me," he replied quietly, his words measured, almost too calm for a 12-year-old. "It was about whether someone in uniform thinks they can erase someone with paper." The man raised his brows slightly but said nothing more. He sat back, thoughtful, as the plane began taxiing toward the runway. A moment later, the curtain separating first class from the rest of the cabin shifted. Another attendant, taller, younger, more visibly uncomfortable, stepped through and paused beside Xavier. He looked like he'd rehearsed his approach multiple times and still didn't believe it would go right. "I just wanted to apologize," he began, clearing his throat. "For earlier. That shouldn't have happened. It's not how we're trained." Xavier gave him a single glance, then nodded. "I know." The attendant seemed to expect more. Maybe forgiveness, maybe a smile. He received neither. After a pause, he turned and retreated behind the curtain, the heavy fabric falling back into place with a soft swish. First class returned to quiet. But it wasn't peace, it was the kind of quiet that waits. Xavier leaned back slightly, his fingertips grazing the stitched armrest. His mind wasn't on the tray table or the view outside, or even the man across the aisle. His thoughts were elsewhere, inside data servers, inside complaint archives, inside the systems that would already be flagging the incident. His uncle wouldn't have missed it. Thomas Marin tracked every clearance involving minors, especially those tied to the FAA's Behavioral Compliance Pilot Program. This wasn't just family. It was fieldwork. A soft ding echoed through the cabin as the plane cleared final taxi instructions. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and composed, thanking passengers for their patience. Xavier barely heard it. His focus had shifted not just to what had happened, but to what it represented. Bryson Hale hadn't simply ripped up a ticket. He had tested the assumption that no one would challenge him. That silence meant safety. That uniforms absolved decisions. And yet, here Xavier sat, seat 2A, FAA cleared, priority flagged, internal systems already alerting. The man across the aisle took out a notepad and began scribbling something. A few rows back, a younger man with headphones looked up, then quickly backed down. On any other flight, Xavier might have been invisible. Today, he wasn't. But he wasn't chasing that spotlight either. Sometimes silence, Xavier thought, teaches louder than protest. The moment the security alert lit up Thomas Marin's terminal in Venture City, he leaned forward in his chair, eyes narrowing as the screen pulsed with a red-coded string. FAA Behavior Audit Breach, Priority Indigo, Gate C9, Halvern International. No time to hesitate. No time to speculate. He tapped twice on his earpiece and spoke into a secure line. Get me full surveillance from Halvern Terminal, gate cameras, mic feeds, all channels. In the quiet of his office, walls lined with dense aviation law books, slow-scrolling compliance dashboards, and a digital map of every FAA-tagged flight, Thomas's composure didn't crack, but his breath slowed. He recognized the flight code immediately, or 204, Orlan Air. That was Xavier's flight. And Xavier was not just a passenger. He was the axis of something far bigger. His assistant, Nolan Bren, stepped in, holding a printed memo. "We have confirmation," he said, voice tight. "Boarding incident." Gate agent tore the ticket. No attempt to verify credentials. Thomas stood, his chair rolling backward silently across the hardwood. He moved to his console, fingers dancing across encrypted keys until a blurred gatecam clip filled the upper left screen. It was grainy, but the moment was unmistakable. Bryson Hale, the gate agent, smirked, tore the ticket down the middle, and flicked it into the trash. Thomas didn't blink. "That's a federal breach." Nolan hesitated. He didn't know who Xavier was, just thought he was another unaccompanied minor. "That's exactly the point," Thomas snapped, not in anger, but in precision. "If you only follow the rules when you recognize power, then your rules are worthless." He turned and lifted a small black panel on his desk, revealing a red-coded phone line reserved for emergencies and executive-level clearance. He pressed the top button. The line pulsed once before connecting. "Callan," Thomas said the moment it picked up, his voice low but urgent. A moment of static, then a man's voice replied, calm, older, and weathered by years of administrative battlefields. "Marin, you don't use this line unless it's fire in the cockpit." "We have a breach at Halvern Terminal," Thomas said evenly.
Gate C9.
Orlan Air. Flight or 204. Code Priority Indigo. On the other end, there was a pause. A shift in the air. Callan Varick's voice came back, steady but grimmer. "That's the discrimination flag, isn't it?" "Confirmed," Thomas replied. He paced slowly between two monitors, scanning timestamp data. "And the target wasn't just any traveler. It was our own." "You ran a live probe?" Callan asked, the words layered with both respect and alarm. "I embedded Xavier as part of the youth compliance audit. I wanted to see how invisible passengers are treated when no one's watching. Well, someone watched. Someone tore. Someone failed." There was no response for a moment. Just the low hum of surveillance feeds flickering between frames. Callan finally exhaled. "You want internal review?" "I want them started before wheels down," Thomas replied, sharp as a captain calling a mayday. "Full compliance traceback. Review of Bryson Hale's prior passenger complaints. And I want an initial judgment filed before this plane touches tarmac in Ventra." Callan didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He simply replied, "Understood. I'll greenlight 3 system protocols immediately. 1 to legal, 1 to compliance, and 1 straight to ethics command. You'll have your reports." Thomas ended the call and returned to the main terminal. He watched as Xavier's flight, now midair at 36,000 feet, moved across the digital map, a quiet white above the Gulf corridor. His jaw tightened. There was something sacred in that stillness, knowing a boy was thousands of feet in the air, calm but alone, while the gears below scrambled to course-correct the damage one careless act had caused. "Sir," Nolan said again, stepping beside him. "What do we tell the press if this leaks before landing?" Thomas turned his head slowly. "We tell them the truth. And if they ask why we embedded a child in a compliance operation, we remind them that children fly alone every day. They're not test subjects. They're the reason the test exists." Outside the glass window of his office, the sky over Ventra dimmed into early dusk. Planes blinked across the skyline, but inside the temperature was rising. 3 internal FAA servers had already flagged Gate C9's incident file with high-priority markers. Bryson Hale's badge had been auto-frozen in the system by a watchdog subroutine. Access revoked. Status pending review. Flight log cross-referencing initiated. Thomas stood still, hands clasped behind his back. A memory surfaced, Xavier at age 7, eyes wide at an airport security checkpoint, asking why his backpack was searched twice while others walked through untouched. "Some people see uniforms," Thomas had told him back then, "but they don't see the people wearing them. One day we'll remind them." Now that day had come. Thomas's eyes drifted to the incident log. Bryson Hale's name glared back, tied now to a red-banded entry that would be reviewed by 3 separate agencies, all before the plane landed. He closed the file with a quiet click and turned off the screen. He didn't smile. He didn't sigh. He simply whispered to the silence of the room, as if narrating what history would soon write. One torn ticket just shredded an airline's illusion of silence. Midway through the flight, as the cabin settled into a hush of quiet conversations and dimmed reading lights, Xavier Marin heard the soft rustle of footsteps approach his seat. He glanced up without lifting his head fully. A senior attendant with a silver pin on his lapel stopped beside him, holding out a small, folded note on airline letterhead. "This was delivered for you, sir," the attendant said, voice clipped and formal. Xavier took it silently. The man waited, then hesitated, unsure if he should say more, before nodding and walking away. Xavier unfolded the note slowly. The airline crest was printed at the top in metallic ink. The message, neatly typed, read, "Dear Mr. Marin, your experience today is unacceptable and not reflective of our values. Upon landing, a representative will meet you to express our apologies and ensure your safety and comfort." It was signed, Vice President, Passenger Relations, Orlan Air. The words were polished, careful. Too careful. He scanned it again, recognizing the corporate tone of panic laced beneath formal contrition. His fingers tightened on the paper once before he folded it again and slid it into the side pocket of his backpack. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply leaned his head back against the seat and stared at the overhead light panel, where the seatbelt sign glowed a steady amber. Minutes passed. Then someone slid into the empty seat beside him. A young male attendant in his early 20s, with a shaved head and a nervous smile, looked over. "Hey," he said quietly, glancing around.
I'm Jalen.
"I'm reserve crew. Just filling in today." Xavier gave a small nod. "I figured." Jalen leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, trying not to draw attention. "I heard what happened at the gate. Some of us, we saw parts of it. Word spreads fast between terminals." He paused, eyes flicking to Xavier's calm expression. "I just wanted to say."
I'm sorry.
Xavier turned slightly, studying him. "You didn't do anything." Jalen's smile faltered. "That's kind of the problem. A lot of us don't know what to say. We think if we speak up, we'll lose our jobs, get flagged, pushed to standby crews, or worse." The boy held his gaze. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his voice even. "Just don't act like it didn't happen." Jalen inhaled slowly. "That's fair," he said, more to himself than to Xavier. A silence settled between them. The low hum of the aircraft engines pulsed beneath their feet. "Do you think anything will change?" Jalen asked after a long pause. Xavier turned back to the window. The night sky was a deep, starless void, pierced occasionally by the blinking lights of distant aircraft. His reflection hovered faintly in the glass. "It already has," he said. "You're sitting next to me now." The answer surprised Jalen. He blinked, then nodded slowly, understanding the layers behind the words. Change didn't always announce itself with banners. Sometimes, it came quietly, in a seat filled that wouldn't have been before, in a conversation once avoided. As the intercom crackled to life and the captain announced descent, the cabin lights dimmed further. Passengers adjusted their seats, buckled belts, and began to stir from half-sleep. But Xavier remained motionless, eyes still fixed on the glass, even as the city lights of Ventra began to flicker beneath the clouds. In that moment, above thousands of flickering rooftops, an unseen network was already responding. Reports were being reviewed in real time. Surveillance feeds had been backed up. FAA systems were cross-referencing gate staff behavior with flight crew protocol. Somewhere in a back office, someone had already flagged the name Bryson Hale under pending investigation priority. Down below, on the tarmac and in anonymous offices, emails were being drafted, calls made, and files unsealed. Xavier knew none of it needed his permission. He had already done his part, not with outrage but with presence, with stillness.
Xavier Agzalatzluli.
He didn't seek fame and he didn't want applause. He only wanted fairness. But the world wasn't asking his permission to turn him into a symbol. As the sedan door closed, sealing him away from the flashing lights, the first headline erupted across the evening news ticker. A journalist typed the caption beneath the leaked frame with quiet certainty, knowing it would become the sentence replayed in conversations nationwide. "This frame," one editor captioned, "is what policy reform looks like before it begins." He ripped the ticket in half, smirking as the boy stood there in silence. If you believe power without compassion collapses on itself, hit subscribe now. Because dignity always flies higher than ego. By evening, the footage had gone viral. The grainy security recording, barely 10 seconds long, showed a moment that now echoed across digital airwaves. A tall gate agent named Bryson Hale tearing a paper ticket with visible contempt, while a quiet boy in a navy polo stood motionless nearby. Within hours, millions had seen it. Some watched with disbelief, others with anger. But no one could deny the truth in the image. A simple act, one hand, one ticket, one smirk, had ignited a national conversation. Newsrooms scrambled to verify the boy's identity. Halvern International issued a vague statement. But by then, the internet had already begun its autopsy of the incident. Hashtags bloomed like wildfire. Hashtag ticket torn, hashtag fly with respect, and the one that stuck, hashtag ripped but not silent. By 7:42 p.m., it had surpassed 3 million mentions. Talk shows took to the airwaves. A popular anchor leaned into the camera and asked viewers, "If this is how we treat children at our gates, what exactly are we flying toward?" Inside FAA headquarters, the response was swift but measured. Xavier's name wasn't officially released. The agency knew protecting his identity was paramount, especially with how emotionally charged the nation had become. Instead, they issued a brief but firm statement. "We are aware of the circulating footage and have initiated a formal compliance review. No further comments at this time." But Thomas Marin, Xavier's uncle, chose a different path. Sitting alone in his office, lit only by a desk lamp and the soft hum of incoming data reports, Thomas typed a letter not as an uncle, but as a policymaker. He wrote carefully, each word chosen with precision and restraint. The open letter was published within the hour on the FAA's official site. It never mentioned Xavier by name, but it didn't need to. A child's right to travel safely must never depend on how they look. The skies are shared by all, and our job is to ensure dignity is not optional. The message was quiet, but it thundered. Within Orlan Air's corporate offices, however, silence was anything but peaceful. The footage had reached the upper board by late afternoon, and emergency lights blinked across conference rooms. Senior legal advisor Grant Thornell slammed his palm on the table. We need a statement. Now, this is spiraling. The CEO, Leonard Dre, wiped his glasses. We'll issue an apology. Make it sound sincere, another executive muttered. But when the statement finally aired, we regret the isolated incident involving a minor and have taken corrective action. It backfired. The wording isolated incident became a meme within hours. Comments poured in, mocking the lack of accountability. Isolated? One tweet read, "The only thing isolated was the kid." Shareholders panicked. A major investment round scheduled for the following week was abruptly postponed. 3 board members called for an internal leadership review. Their insurance partner flagged the airline for reputational risk. And then Bryson Hale was terminated. Effective immediately, his employee ID was deactivated. He was escorted out of Halvern's staff entrance without ceremony. But even that wasn't enough. Not to the public, not to the FAA, and not to the systems that had quietly watched this unfold from the inside. Because the moment Bryson's name was entered into the compliance system, something else lit up. His profile wasn't clean. 6 prior incidents, 3 verbal complaints, 2 written reports, and 1 formal inquiry, all quietly dismissed. The documents were already being compiled. One internal agent noted, "This wasn't a rogue agent. This was a culture that gave him clearance." Inside the FAA's Office of Risk Pattern Analytics, a technician named Dorian watched the data unfold across his screen. He leaned back in his chair and murmured, "We're not just looking at one man. We're looking at a runway we let crack without repair." As the night deepened, networks began interviewing travel rights advocates, civil rights attorneys, and former airline staff. One former gate supervisor, speaking anonymously, said, "It's not new. It's just finally visible." In homes across the country, parents held their children closer. Students wrote essays. Teachers opened class discussions. The image of Xavier, reaching calmly into the trash to retrieve his torn ticket, became iconic, shared alongside captions like, "He didn't shout, he just didn't back down." But Xavier himself stayed out of sight. No press conferences.
No interviews.
He sat quietly, thousands of feet in the air, unaware that he had just become a symbol of silent strength. A reminder that courage doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wears khakis and carries a ripped boarding pass. And back in his uncle's office, Thomas watched the footage again. Not to relive the pain, but to remember the moment it began. His voice low, he repeated the sentence he had shared earlier that day in a private agency meeting. "You can't fix a storm by grounding one plane," he said. "You fix the weather pattern above the whole runway." Inside the high-security briefing room of FAA headquarters, the atmosphere was thick with urgency. No media.
No observers.
Just the polished hum of fluorescent lighting above a long oval table surrounded by some of the most powerful men in civil aviation regulation. At the head sat Thomas Marin, his face stern but composed, a single folder resting before him labeled, "Gate C9 Incident, Priority Indigo." On either side of him were compliance leads, ethics auditors, and Elias Kaur, FAA's top legal strategist known for dismantling airline defenses with methodical precision. Thomas opened the folder and laid out a crisp employee report. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice measured but charged, "what you are about to see is not just negligence, it's recurrence." With a motion to the screen, a transcript scrolled onto the wall. Complaint logs. 6 previous grievances tied to the name Bryson Hale. Each entry coded, documented, buried. Selective enforcement. Disregard of procedural verification. And most damning, multiple verbal complaints from passengers of color that never reached arbitration. Thomas's finger paused on one line. "This one," he said. Passenger described Hale as confrontational when questioned on boarding rights. No security footage reviewed. No follow-up. Why? The room was silent. Then Elias leaned forward, tapping the digital ledger. Internal arbitration marked it low priority, cited employee tenure, and lack of corroborating witness. Convenient, considering no one pulled the camera feed. The silence hung. Finally, Thomas stood. His voice hardened, not from anger, but from resolve. This incident may have centered on my nephew, he said, scanning the faces of his colleagues. But this meeting is about how many we didn't see. He let that sink in, then continued. The problem isn't just hail. The problem is every unchecked smirk, every torn ticket, every moment we told someone to move along, because we didn't want noise. A younger compliance director, Matteo Varin, shifted uneasily. What are you proposing? He asked. Thomas didn't sit. Protocol transformation, he replied. We need something agile, untraceable, incorruptible. I propose Project Horizon Line, a civilian-embedded compliance review system.
No uniforms. No warnings.
Real passengers trained to observe, not just how crews treat them, but how they treat the ones they think no one's watching. Core rubbed his chin. Like secret shoppers, only with federal teeth. Yes, Thomas nodded. We embed monitors randomly across gates, flights, customer service desks. They report directly to us. Immediate response channels. Anonymous incident flags. No middle layers. A murmur of cautious approval rippled around the table. Some men leaned in. Others checked their tablets, already imagining rollout challenges. But the tide had turned. The vote was unanimous. The directive was signed before the meeting adjourned. As the signatures dried, a data feed lit up on the side screen. Orlan Air's investor dashboard showed activity spikes, share price dipping, flagged keywords like discrimination, whistleblower footage, unprocessed complaints. It wasn't just public backlash, it was financial hemorrhage. Thomas tapped the feed. Their board was prepping an international expansion deal, he said. They needed clean optics. Now their biggest asset is contaminated reputation. Core added, 3 of their regional managers were copied on prior complaints. They advised gate agents to minimize reportable interactions until the deal closed. And Hale? Someone asked. Terminated, said Thomas. But that's not enough. We're reopening every dismissed file attached to his name. A final clip appeared on screen, a paused frame from the leaked video. Bryson Hale, mid-motion, tearing Xavier's ticket with a smug expression. Elias leaned back and exhaled. That one still frame will haunt every executive who let this slide. Thomas crossed his arms. His voice dropped. Good. Let it haunt them. Let it remind them that next time, silence won't protect anyone. He glanced at the framed mission statement above the door, to serve, to secure, to uphold. His jaw tightened. Outside the conference room, the buzz of daily operations continued, planes being monitored, routes optimized, algorithms tracking turbulence. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. For once, the system had looked inward and didn't like what it saw. And it all started with a boy who refused to step aside. As the room cleared and chairs pushed back against marble floors, Thomas remained still for a moment. He stared at the torn ticket on the screen, now infamous. Then he turned to Elias, voice low and even. You don't need to be loud to start a storm, he said. You just need to stand where the silence usually is. Xavier sat cross-legged on his bed, the quiet hum of the ceiling fan above barely masking the silence that had filled the room since he'd returned. The light from the hallway cast long shadows on his walls, where school awards and childhood drawings shared space with a calendar still stuck on the week he left for Venture City. His phone buzzed repeatedly with alerts, news articles, commentaries, social media mentions, but he didn't open them. He hadn't done a single interview, hadn't spoken to a reporter. It wasn't pride or fear that kept him silent. It was purpose. The world was talking about what happened, but Xavier was already thinking about what came next. A soft knock echoed from the hallway. Before he could respond, the door creaked open and Thomas Marin stepped inside, dressed in a dark overcoat, his eyes tired but calm. In his left hand, he carried a sealed manila folder. Hey, champ, he said, his voice low. Got something for you. Xavier looked up, sitting straighter, but didn't say a word. Thomas walked across the room and sat on the desk chair, spinning it slightly to face him. The folder rested on his lap. This isn't a medal, he began, tone firm but warm. And it's not a reward. He extended the folder toward Xavier, who took it slowly. His fingers trembled slightly as he unsealed the flap and pulled out the documents inside. At the top, printed in bold across FAA letterhead, were the words, Junior Consultant Appointment, Youth Travel Rights Committee.
Xavier Blinca.
The papers listed him by full name, age, and effective date. They bore signatures of authorization from multiple directors. It was real. "What is this?" he asked, not quite able to keep the disbelief from his voice. Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "It's a seat at the table," he said. "You'd be part of the first minor advisory council for passenger policy, especially around solo travelers. Not ceremonial, not a token role. You'll review draft protocols, help shape recommendations, and be part of internal review panels under my supervision." Xavier looked back at the paper, his heart pounding. "I'm not a lawyer," he said softly. "I'm not even old enough to drive." "Exactly," Thomas replied, his gaze steady. "They've heard from every kind of expert, legal analysts, behavioral psychologists, security advisors. But not from you. Not from the kids these rules are supposed to protect." Xavier let the folder rest on his knees. His eyes drifted toward the window. Outside, the streetlights flickered on. A boy on a bicycle zoomed past, free and unaware. Inside, the air felt heavier. "What if I say the wrong thing?" he asked. Thomas smiled faintly. "Then you'll learn. But you're not being asked to be perfect. Just honest." He stood slowly, adjusting his coat. "You've already done the hard part, Xavier. You stayed calm when you were erased. Now you get to help make sure no one else is." There was a long silence between them. Then Xavier spoke, voice low but deliberate. "Okay," he whispered. "But I'm not going to talk about myself. I'm going to talk about the kids they didn't see." Thomas reached out and placed a firm hand on his nephew's shoulder. The grip was steady, but not heavy. That's how real leaders start. Xavier didn't realize it then, but his name was already being circulated through national committees. "The ones who know what it's like to be erased," he said, "should be the first ones rewriting the rules." Weeks later, the formal FAA hearing began without fanfare, but the weight in the room was undeniable. A hush had already fallen over the packed chamber before the gavel dropped. Rows of sharply dressed airline executives, gate crew union representatives, compliance officers, and federal officials filled the semicircular gallery. The tension wasn't just procedural, it was personal. Everyone there knew this was no ordinary regulatory meeting. It was history in session. At the center of the long, polished oak table sat Xavier Marin's sealed policy recommendations, just a few pages thick, printed in clean black ink on white paper. But they may as well have been thunder on paper. To the side, a large monitor waited silently, its blank screen reflecting the anxious faces of those seated nearby. At the edge of the room, camera crews adjusted their tripods for the live broadcast, the red standby lights flickering on. A national audience was already tuned in. FAA Director Lawson Viral, a gray-haired man with sharp eyes and a reputation for restraint, opened the hearing with a single statement. "Today, we do not rewrite rules. We reclaim them." Then he nodded to Thomas Marin, who rose with quiet purpose, carrying Xavier's packet. His face was calm but firm, shoulders squared beneath a plain navy suit, eyes revealing a storm controlled only by duty. "Presented today are the first-hand observations and formal recommendations from Junior Consultant Xavier Marin," Thomas began. "They are written without legal jargon. They are not diluted by politics. They are what a 12-year-old saw, felt, and understood when his rights were threatened." He began reading aloud, one line at a time. "Every passenger, regardless of age, race, or class, has the right to dignity from entry to exit." A low murmur passed through the chamber. Some leaned back in their chairs. Others leaned forward. The sentence lingered in the air as if daring anyone to oppose it. "If a ticket is torn, so is trust. Rebuild both." The words hit like a weight. Airline executives exchanged stiff glances. One union leader, a grizzled man with silver hair and a flight crew pin on his lapel, lowered his gaze, lips pressed tight. The uniform is not a shield. It's a responsibility. That line stirred the room. Subtle shifts of discomfort moved like waves. Behind Thomas, a compliance official blinked slowly, visibly shaken. Everyone knew the line wasn't theoretical. It was about them. The screen behind them flickered to life. No announcement. No que. Just a grainy still image. Xavier, at the gate, bending down to the trash bin, retrieving the shredded remains of his boarding ticket. His small hand clutched the torn paper as his eyes stared forward, quiet but fierce. A child without a podium, without a voice raised, but with a presence that refused to be ignored. A silence deeper than any gavel followed. And in that stillness, a voice from the gallery, soft, almost reverent, broke through. That moment, that's when everything changed. It was a board member, not mic'd, not scheduled to speak. But no one corrected him. No one needed to. Lawson Viral turned toward the sidewall. Slowly, an aide unveiled a glass frame that had been covered with black velvet. Inside, behind glare-free protective glass, was the actual torn ticket. Taped back together, it seems visible, its tear lines imperfect. Above it, etched into brass, were the words chosen unanimously just days before. The day silence boarded, but dignity landed. There was no applause, only stillness. Thomas exhaled slowly, his voice a whisper now, only just picked up by the microphone. Xavier's voice didn't need volume, he said, pausing to look out over the room. It only needed clarity. Then one last quote was read aloud, the one that would later be carved into the wall beside the framed ticket. Some tickets aren't for travel, he said. They're for proof of who we still are and who we refuse to become. 6 months later, the atrium of Halvern International's East Terminal was transformed into something it had never been before. A place of reckoning, remembrance, and redefinition. The newly renovated wing, now gleaming with polished stone and light panels, bore a name etched in steel above its central entrance. The Horizon Line Concourse. Beneath the signage, a stage stood flanked by banners bearing the FAA's insignia and the seal of Orlan Air. But no symbol drew more attention than the transparent glass case positioned at center stage, lit from beneath. Inside it, resting on black velvet, were the torn and taped fragments of a boarding pass, Xavier Marin's shredded ticket, now immortalized not as evidence of an incident, but as a relic of transformation. Hundreds gathered, FAA commissioners in dark suits, airline executives straightening their ties, unions representing gate agents, pilots, and attendants, student ambassadors from youth travel programs, and scattered throughout the crowd, former passengers, some young, some elderly, many of whom knew too well the sting of silent profiling. The weight in the air wasn't from ceremony. It was from shared memory. The announcer stepped forward. "Gentlemen and guests," he began, voice echoing gently through the terminal. "Today we don't just reopen a gate. We reset a standard." Then came the moment they had all been waiting for. A side curtain pulled aside, and Xavier Marin stepped into view. He was still only 12. His navy blazer seemed just slightly too big on his thin shoulders, and his polished shoes clicked softly against the temporary stage floor. But his stride was unshaken. He walked past the shredded ticket without flinching and stood at the podium, alone, without notes. The cameras clicked. The lights shifted, but Xavier didn't speak right away. He looked out across the crowd with a calmness that seemed older than his years. When he finally did speak, his voice carried clearly. "I'm not here to be the face of a campaign," he said, hands resting gently on either side of the podium. "I'm here because I want this to be the last time someone rips up more than paper." A quiet stillness fell over the atrium. Even the air conditioning seemed to hush. "I know what it's like," Xavier continued, eyes drifting across the rows. "To be looked at and still not seen. To be asked questions with answers already written against you. I didn't ask for that lesson, but I didn't ignore it either." He took a breath. "You all came here today to show that change is happening. And maybe it is. But a concourse with a new name isn't change if the people inside it haven't changed. Policy is just a sentence. Dignity is action. A murmur rippled through the front rows. Several executives shifted in their seats. Some looked down. Others looked at Xavier with something between admiration and discomfort. "You can keep saying this wasn't who we are," Xavier said, his tone steady. "But that day when my ticket was ripped, when no one stepped forward, that was who you were. And if we're not honest about that, we'll never become anything better." He paused then, not to gather his thoughts, but to let the silence do some of the work. "But today," he said, his voice softening, "that changes. Today you don't just board a plane. You carry the right to be respected." A single person began clapping, an older man in the third row wearing a faded airport maintenance badge. Then another, and another, until the entire atrium rose slowly to its feet. The applause was quiet but firm, like acknowledgement, not celebration. Xavier stepped back from the podium without bowing, without waving. He simply nodded once and exited the stage, walking toward the side curtain with the same quiet composure that had brought him there. As he passed by the shredded ticket in its glass case, a spotlight overhead shifted slightly, casting a soft halo across the display. The crowd didn't sit down. No one moved. A hush returned as a second announcer stepped forward, his voice careful and clear. Behind him, a banner unfurled on the stage wall, revealing bold letters in a simple font. Every flight, every passenger, every time. The Orlan Air CEO, seated in the front row, blinked rapidly and wiped at the corner of his eye. He wasn't alone. Several others, including gate supervisors and FAA representatives, sat in silence, visibly moved. No speech could follow Xavier's. Nothing needed to. In that moment, the message was clear. This wasn't just about one flight, one boy, or one mistake. It was about the next one, and the next. "When one voice rewrites policy," the announcer said, "you don't need a podium, just the courage to be heard." Xavier Marin stepped onto the jet bridge with silent precision, his posture calm, composed. The terminal lighting overhead cast long shadows across the carpet, but Xavier's eyes were sharp beneath his low baseball cap. His boarding pass bore no real name, only the designation X.402. To most around him, he was just another traveler catching a red-eye. But this wasn't just any flight, and Xavier wasn't just any passenger. Gate C9, Orlan Air, same as a decade ago. The same airline, the same terminal corridor. But everything else had changed. Or at least it was supposed to. The gate agent scanned his pass and glanced at his face. There was no hesitation this time. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Marin," the agent said with practiced ease. "We've been briefed about your review." His voice was respectful, but his hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward the door. Xavier didn't smile. He nodded once and replied evenly, "Don't perform for me. Perform for them." He tilted his chin toward the line of passengers behind him. An elderly man in a wheelchair waiting quietly. A teenage boy wearing headphones and traveling alone. A woman with a service dog looking down anxiously at her paperwork. The agent's throat bobbed with a quiet swallow. "Understood, sir." Xavier stepped into the cabin and moved slowly down the aisle. He wore no badge, no emblem, and didn't flash any credentials. That was the point. His authority came from his anonymity. His power was in watching how the unnoticed were treated when no one thought the rules were watching back. He took seat 4D, aisle, just enough to observe. The flight crew bustled through final checks. A younger attendant named Milo stopped at his row, eyes briefly flicking to the notes on the manifest. "Can I get you anything before takeoff?" he asked. The tone was professional, not performative, measured. Xavier studied him for a breath. "I'm fine." "Thank you." The overhead bins clicked shut. The elderly man was assisted with care into his seat. The teen across the aisle had his music politely paused during the safety check by a kind tap and a smile. The woman with the service dog was offered a seat reassignment for more space without having to ask. Xavier took mental notes. Every interaction, every glance, every decision made when no spotlight burned overhead. During the flight, he didn't sleep. He kept his gaze moving like a camera set to record, not judge. Flight crews didn't know which passengers were plants. That was part of the reform. Random field evaluations post-horizon line. And tonight, Xavier was the standard. Halfway through the flight, an older gentleman in row 6 began coughing heavily. Within seconds, an attendant rushed over with water, tissues, and quiet reassurance. No panique. No delay. No judgment. Just care. Xavier's fingers tapped against the armrest once, then stilled. As the plane began its descent into Ventura City, Xavier quietly reached into his carry-on and pulled out a sleek, matte black tablet. He typed slowly. His report didn't need flourish, just truth. After a few moments, he submitted the entire evaluation in a single, crisp line. Compliance observed. Integrity sustained. The flight landed smoothly. As passengers disembarked, Xavier remained seated, allowing the others to leave first. That was part of it too, watching how the staff treated the last passenger, not just the first. Once the cabin cleared, he gathered his belongings and exited without a word. Later that night, in a quiet hotel room near the terminal, Xavier sat alone at a small desk. The city lights blinked beyond the curtains. He unlatched the hard case beside him, opened a sealed folder, and unfolded a laminated photograph, the torn boarding pass from 10 years ago. The corners were worn now, the ink slightly faded, but the ripped line still ran jagged across the center like a scar. He didn't smile, didn't frown. He simply stared at it. Then, without ceremony, he placed the photograph into a file labeled Field Evaluation. 10 years later, and closed the case with a soft click. Standing by the window, he looked out at the airport tarmac below, watching the blue glow of runway lights in the distance. Somewhere out there, a new traveler was boarding. Maybe someone overlooked, maybe someone afraid, but not alone. His voice was barely a whisper. What they ripped, he whispered, built everything I now protect. He shredded a child's right to travel, and froze when the father revealed the FAA badge that could ground their whole company. If you believe justice always boards on time, subscribe now, because every action leaves a trail. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights racism, prejudice, and the swift accountability that follows when ignorance meets authority. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, respect, and justice in every corner of the travel industry and beyond.